tells Watson. But look at all those lonely houses, each in its own fields, filled for the most part with poor ignorant folk who know little of the law. Think of the deeds of hellish cruelty, the hidden wickedness which may go on year in, year out in such places, and none the wiser. So the scene described by Holmes could be set in this village of Great Worley. And I'm just going to share my screen and bring up some images. This, let's go to the slideshow. Sorry, give me a second. Great slide. Yeah, so this scene could have been set in this village of Great Worley. And let's go to the beginning. I mean, who is, let's answer the first story. Who is this Parsee lawyer? Well, his name is George Edalji. He's 28-year-old, and he lives in a village called Great Worley, which is sort of south of Birmingham. It's in the Midlands. And his father, Shapurji Edalji, is the vicar of the church in Great Worley. So he is, it's the St. Mary's Church, and Shapurji Edalji is the vicar. And George is born in 1876. So this story spreads over two. It begins in the Victorian period and it goes on to the Edwardian period. And this is the time the vicar of Great Worley is appointed. It's also it's the height of the Victorian period. Queen Victoria has been pronounced as the Empress of India. She's given this title. And here in this remote village, Shapurji Edalji becomes the first vicar of Great Worley. He's the first South Asian vicar. And a few months later, their first son, George, is born. Shapurji has married an English woman, Charlotte. But before I go into George's life, I found Shapurji's life really interesting. I mean, what brought him here? What brought him here to Great Worley? So I'm going to go, sort of flashback a little bit. Shapurji was from Bombay. I'll say Bombay because that's what it was known as in those days. So do forgive me. I'm not using the word Mumbai at the moment. So Shapurji, this is Shapurji. He was born in Bombay and he converted to Christianity. Now he was born in a very sort of wealthy Parsee family. And as we all know, for those here, I'm sure, I mean, this is in India, everybody knows Parsees, but just for those who, in case anybody doesn't know, the Parsees came from Persia in the 7th century and they settled. This was under Arab persecution, so they fled, they came to India, they settled around Bombay and Karachi in these port cities. They were very wealthy. They adapted quickly. They learned the local language, Gujarati. They were called Parsees because they'd come from Persia. And they soon became merchants, trading with the East India Company, trading in opium, textiles, and became fairly wealthy. Parsees were, of course, very cultured. They were political as well, in politics, in business. And the first British MP was none other than Dadabhai Naoroji, somebody who's well known in India. And this is his portrait. He was from the Liberal Party. This is his portrait at the Liberal Club in London. So the only 3 politicians of Indian origin, and this is really interesting, in UK to be elected before independence, all 3 of them were Parsees. So you can see how educated, how westernized, and how political as well they were. So of course, they were in business. This is the Tatas, who everybody knows. It's the Tata family in India. And of course, they were in music as well. So Shapurji is sent to Elphinstone College in Bombay. You're all familiar with this. He was going to be brought up, maybe be a lawyer or whatever, but he got attracted to Christianity. Now, because the Parsees belonged to this, slightly westernized and educated classes, they were seen as sort of rich picking grounds for conversion. So a lot of Parsees were converted to Christianity. And Shapurji himself, he was just 15 years old when he found that he was fascinated by Christian texts. And he went and he ran away from home. He went and he knocked on, Reverend John Wilson's house, and he said, baptize me. So you can imagine his family was really upset. But there he was taken in, he was baptized. At his baptism, he said he was, finally going to be civilized. So you can see he was really taken in by Christianity and Christian texts at such a young age. But of course, once he'd become a Christian, his family, he had to leave his family. He'd already run away. So he had nothing to do. He started practicing Christianity, learning. He went to various other places in Maharashtra, worked with the Wali tribals. But eventually he wanted to go to the UK. He wanted to, learn, further his studies. And he wrote this book, a dictionary called Gujarati English Dictionary. And with the sale proceeds, he then funds his travels and he leaves for England. So he says goodbye to his old city and he goes to England, where he travels for 10 years. And finally, he goes to Liverpool. It's there he falls in love with this young English woman, Charlotte, and they get married. Now, Charlotte is also very interesting because her father was a vicar and she came from a family of vicars. So not only is Shapurji, finally he has a family to call his own, but also it's quite useful. Charlotte's connections are useful to him. So one of Charlotte's uncles was the vicar of Great Worley, and he was going to retire. So he gifts his curacy very conveniently to his niece's new husband. And that is how Shapurji Edalji becomes the vicar of Great Worley, the first South Asian vicar. But of course, you can picture this scene, 1876, as I said, height of Victorian rule and empire. And here is this brown man preaching the word of Christ to an all-white parish. It was going to be in trouble. So soon they start their family. And here is the Edalji family. You can see Shapurji. This is Shapurji, his wife Charlotte. This is George. He is probably about 14 or 15 in this photograph. His younger brother is Horace, and this is the youngest sister, Maud. It's a very close-knit family. George is a shy young boy. He's very intelligent, he's bright, but trouble is soon going to, come to this family in the vicarage, the only colored family in this village. And it starts when George is just 12, actually, in 1888. So one day, Shapurji finds that the wall of the vicarage is painted with graffiti, which says, the Edaljis are wicked. So he's puzzled, he's upset, he wipes it off, and he thinks nothing of it. But then the letters start appearing. Anonymous letters are left on the steps of the vicarage, and these are the sort of notes that are left. You can see the handwriting in these, it's like a kid's handwriting with sort of crude drawings of George. This little note says, for your bloody father, Reverend S. Edalji. And this sort of goes on. And they're slowly getting more and more threatening. And Shapurji now is really worried. The kids are, scared. He goes to the police. And so the first of the policemen arrive at the vicarage, and they start suspecting the maid who works there. There's a 17-year-old maid called Elizabeth Foster, and they think that she has done this. So they arrest Elizabeth Foster. They find some letters in her trunk. They arrest her. But when she's at the police station, her lawyer pleads that she's just 17 years old. If this goes to trial, her life is finished. Let her plead guilty, give her a warning, let her off. And the vicar is a kind-hearted man. He says, sure, and she's let off. He thinks end of chapter, but of course it's not. As she leaves the police station, she swears revenge and she says she is innocent. So this, you can see within 6 months, these letters start again. They're calling him a fool. He's asking for revenge. And it just sort of carries on. And it's getting more and more aggressive. So these scraps of papers, you can see, are left outside the vicarage. And this one says, it shows a beggar woman holding a child, and it says, your mother. Um, there are other things you can see in this. It says, is Mr. Edalji a bigger fool than he looks? My name is God Satan. I am God. So this person who's writing these letters is also, there's a bit of a maniac about him, a religious maniac. There are letters and letters in which he says, I am God Satan. He signs them as God Satan. The vicar is really worried. He says, this man is in this village. It's very clear that he's somebody local. And he even puts he puts an article in the newspaper saying somebody will recognize this handwriting. Somebody will, make a connection and know somebody who speaks like this. But he's getting no help from the police and no help from anybody. What makes it worse is that the policeman there, this Constable Sergeant Upton, he says that he is convinced that the person who's writing these notes is no other than this awkward young boy who lives there, the eldest son, George Edalji. And he sort of goes about saying this openly in the pubs that, oh, it's all a hoax. It's all happening because this man is, it's George, it's this boy. And of course, these rumors are going around the village, and the aggression is just getting worse. So meanwhile, George is growing up. This is going over years. And here's another letter. See, it says, big, I'm a dangerous man asking for money. But the family just find that there's nothing, no help coming from anywhere. And then one day, by now George is a teenager. He goes to a grammar school. He's got admission there. As I said, he was very bright. He goes to a grammar school. It's called the Rugeley Grammar School. He now takes a train and goes every morning. And he's very quiet. He doesn't have too many friends. There are lots of other boys on this train, but they don't really talk much to him. Of course, he's dark-skinned, he's the odd one out of this gang. And then a peculiar thing happens. So one day, a huge key is left outside the vicarage. It's a big, large key. And when the vicar hands it in, the policeman, Sergeant Upton, he's convinced that this key has been stolen by George from his school, Rugeley Grammar School. And he says, I'll prove that it's from Rugeley Grammar School. And of course, he's wrong, because the key is actually from another grammar school, Walsall Grammar School. And there is absolutely no reason why George would go 6 miles away, steal a key, excuse me, from this school, and then come and put it outside his doorstep. I mean, it defies logic. But Sergeant Upton is convinced that it's this boy. He's the one who's done it. He's not bothering to question other schoolboys. All these other boys on the train are going to Walsall. It could have been them, but he doesn't question them. So this goes on. And then George, he writes to the chief constable of the area, and he says, all this is happening, and this is the reason behind this is George. So for the first time, as a 17-year-old, George is now coming under the radar of the Staffordshire police. So it's all getting really, really serious here, and very upsetting for the poor vicar and his family, who are also now being subjected to these strange hoaxes. So letters are going out saying that Charlotte is very ill, Mrs. Edalji is very ill, can the doctors come? And a doctor comes rushing and finds that, she's not ill at all. There's nothing wrong with Mrs. Edalji. In fact, nobody's ill in the house. And so they get upset, their time has been, wasted, they go back. Then there's other times when tradesmen are called in. So suddenly Shapurji finds that truckloads of tiles, building tiles, or roofers are arriving saying, we have to mend your roof. And he said, my roof's not leaking, nothing's happening. And they have to be sent back. So again, he goes to the newspapers and he says, somebody is playing these hoaxes and tricks and wasting people's time. So please, if anybody gets a note saying I need something, contact me first before you send the delivery. So life is really getting tough for this, family over there. But they carry on, and the letter writer carries on. So this is the map of the vicarage, which he sends to Anson, and he says, look, this is, all the things I'm being accused of could not have happened. This is where George lives. Come and visit this vicarage. But Anson, the chief of police, he can't be bothered. He doesn't come. Meanwhile, letter writer continues. So as I said, he was a bit of a maniac because one day he deposits 72 items outside the vicarage. And these include things like bootlaces, drops of excreta, collar studs, a little purse, a knife, all sorts of odd objects are left outside and in envelopes. And they are just, finally they say, family just give up. They say there's no point going to the police. No one's helping. They just get on with their lives. And then suddenly in 1895, everything stops. No more letters, no more deposits of weird material, no more hoaxes. Suddenly the family can breathe again. They think, maybe this letter writer has left the area. Maybe he's gone. Maybe we can return to normal. And meanwhile, of course, time is passing. George is now cleared his university. He's studied, he's graduated in law, he's won medals, he's got a bronze certificate. He now has a job in a solicitor's office in Birmingham. So he's joined this law firm. He's very proud of his certificates. His family are very proud of him, and he displays them on his wall. And they think, okay, troubles are behind us. So this is an image of young George. So he even writes a book. I think the whole family liked to write. So remember, his father Shapurji had written this Gujarati English dictionary, and now George writes a book about railway law for the man in the train. It even gets reviewed in the local press, and so things seem to be going on track for the Edaljis for a bit. Little breather in their lives. And now, to tell you a little bit about George, he's actually just a very ordinary, young man. He leads a very mundane life. Even after he's grown up, he still lives in the vicarage. He lives there. He commutes to Birmingham every day. He takes the 8:45 train in the morning. He takes the same train back in the evening. And that's his life, really. He doesn't drink, so he doesn't go to pubs with other colleagues. He doesn't have any other friends. He's a bit of a loner, and he likes to go for long walks in the countryside. And things are on track, but of course, everything's going to change once again. So in 1903, things are going to get very dark for the Edaljis. Suddenly, this little village of Great Worley is seized by a new terror. Somebody is coming in the night and slashing animals. They are leaving them mutilated, dying in the fields. Of course, the police, here you can see the policemen are searching the fields. This has happened. And this goes on. It starts in February and it keeps on at repeated intervals. And the police, as you've probably said, the police from the past, they were hopeless. They continue to be hopeless. They cannot find the killer. They are in patrol. They are watching everywhere. Nothing is happening. And the villagers are terrified. So, somebody comes at night, rips these horses with the same sort of knife, the same type of mutilation, and goes away in the dead of night. So the papers are covering it. There is terror in the village. The farmers want to lock up their cattle at night. The children, the girls are told not to go out at night. And they call him the Worley Ripper. He becomes known as the Worley Ripper. And people are reminded of, a few years back, Jack the Ripper, who used to mutilate women and leave them to die. And so this terror is really gripping them. And as this is happening, here we can see, so these workmen, they have to load these horses onto carts and take them, the mutilated horses. And people see them. Crowds of photographers come and they take the images. It's become like people from neighboring villages. The minute they hear there's been another crime, they all come racing down to see it. There's almost something voyeuristic going on there as well. And so the new inspector who's coming now, the old Sergeant Upton, he was transferred. He was finally dismissed on grounds of drunkenness. And he is replaced by a new inspector. Sorry. So this is, as this is happening, the other thing that starts to add to this, the mutilation of cattle, is that mysteriously the anonymous letters start again. And here they are. This time they are naming George Edalji. So they are written to the police, they are written to George, they are written to other people in the village, and they start suggesting. Some of them even name George, and others are saying that look out for this train, and there will be this man with a sly look on his face, carrying a dagger, stuff like that. The letters going out to the police. This one is a threatening letter saying, "I will shoot you through your thick head." And there's another letter that says, "Now we're going to start on the little ones, the little girls." So there is complete panic. And of course, the police are watching, and now they start watching George Edalji. So there is that history of the old letters. And suddenly, when the new set of letters arrive, they think, oh God, it's him again. They are convinced. And this man is the new inspector, Inspector Campbell. He's in charge. And he has inherited the same prejudices as his predecessor. So they're watching the vicarage, they're watching George Edalji, and here's Inspector Campbell again standing outside a house. And when a horse is mutilated just half a mile from the vicarage, they round down him and they arrest George. So they go to his office in Birmingham, arrest him, and then they go to the vicarage and they remove a coat, a pair of boots, and a razor. And they say that the coat has horsehairs on it. So the vicar takes this coat to the window and he says, "Where are these horsehairs?" And then he says, "It's not a horsehair, it's a bit of thread." But the police are unconvinced. They say it's a horsehair. They say the boots are wet. But of course, boots would be wet because it's a rainy August. And he had probably stepped into puddles or, walked in the rain. They also go get a razor and say it's wet. Well, somebody would have used a razor to shave in the morning, so it might have been wet. Anyway, they come to George. George says that he never used a razor because he used to always get shaved at the barber's shop. He says he hadn't gone out that night at all. He had been at home, and there are several witnesses who know that he went to bed after 10 and he woke up at 7:30 and left for work. Then they say there's a coat with horsehairs, and he says, "Well, that's not a coat I ever wear outdoors. It's a coat it's a rather shabby old coat, and I wear it indoors. I just wear it around the house." And as for the boots, he said, "Well, I might have stepped into a puddle, and that's why they're wet." But none of this matters to the police. So they take him, they lock him up, and we are going to see George's picture in the police files. He looks terrible because everyone does in a police photograph, profile, front. This is a lawyer, a good lawyer, well read, who's written, and suddenly he's being accused of mutilating horses. He said he'd never touched a horse in his life. He has nothing to do with farmers and farming. Anyway, so he is arrested. There is huge media interest, of course. Suddenly, this Whirly Ripper has been caught. And of course, he is this man, this dark Oriental called George Edalji. And the trial begins, crowds descend on the courtroom. It's like so as they described it, the first night of the sales or something. Everybody's crowding in. These are scenes from the courtroom, and it takes only 55 minutes for an all-white male jury to pronounce George guilty. He is then sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. So it's a long sentence. Now, George, of course, says, this is just shatters him because 7 years is a really harsh term. You can see the press, they are very interested. This story is being covered. And I'm just going to read you a little extract from what they've written in the press. So the Daily Mail, the sort of tone they were taking. The Daily Mail reported, "Those who have closely studied this extraordinary criminal in the dock would have no doubt that he is a degenerate of the worst type. His jaw and mouth are those of a man of very debased life. Edalji has also gained for himself the reputation of being a lover of mystery, another Oriental trait, and one that goes far to explain the anonymous letters." The Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote, the explanation of the choice is probably to be found in the circumstances that Edalji is of Eastern extraction. The subtle Eastern mind loves a mystery and is vain. And there were other reporters who wrote that what the villagers were discussing in the village was that the reason George was committing these crimes is that he belonged to a strange religion, and which demanded that he sacrifice, nocturnal sacrificing of animals. And so you can see this is complete nonsense, sort of, that they're writing and thinking, because obviously Zoroastrianism has nothing to do with this. They just know vaguely that they worship the sun and the moon and nature, and they confuse it with the Hinduism and the Thagi cult, and sacrifices made to Kali, and all these images of what Indians do and Indian religion plays on their minds. And of course, George is, he's never even been to India. He's born in Great Worli, never left Worli, baptized in the local church, and is a Christian. But he's still seen as the foreigner, a man with a very strange, within quotes, religion. So George is locked away. He's locked away in a jail, and he's visited by his family. But his father, Shapurji, and his mother, they are determined. I mean, you can see in this image how careworn Shapurji looks. He's determined to keep fighting to clear George's name. So he starts a petition, and also once the trial is over, a lot of legal minds, because it's got so much coverage, a lot of legal minds get involved, and they say that this is a miscarriage of justice. All this evidence, would not hold in a court. It was tried in a lower court, and there was a lot of prejudice at the time, and they were juries influenced by newspaper reports and coverage, and so they start a petition, and 10,000 people sign a petition to the Home Office. So he's saying that, George is innocent. So suddenly 3 years later, in his mid-sentence, George is released on parole. He is brought back, he's released in London, and he doesn't know what to do because he can't practice. I mean, it's very good that he's out, but he's been, dismissed from the solicitor's roles, so he can't practice as a solicitor. He's too scared to go back to Great Worli because he thinks that if another cattle is slashed, they'll blame me again. So he doesn't want to go back there. And he has no means of income. He doesn't know what to do. And so in desperation, he writes to the one man he thinks can save him. But this is, of course, a leaflet produced by Shapurji Edalji, who writes the whole thing about the injustice, the case of George Edalji. And George himself writes an article. He writes in the Umpire magazine, and he says, why he's innocent, but nothing, nobody's getting moved. He's not being, he's got no job. He now writes to the one man he thinks can save him, and this is, of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Now, George has been reading these books, Arthur Conan Doyle's books, in prison, and he feels that the only person who can save him is the man who created Sherlock Holmes, the man who can solve these mysteries. And he writes to him and says, please help me clear my name, I'm innocent. And Arthur Conan Doyle rises to this challenge. This is 1906. Now, the time that Arthur Conan Doyle gets this letter from George, he himself is going through a low phase in his life. His wife of several years, Louise, has died. And so he is, so there's the great sorrow that she has died of tuberculosis after all the nursing he's done. But there is also guilt because after all these years, while nursing his wife, Arthur Conan Doyle fell in love again. He fell in love with a young woman called Jean Lecky. And now he's free to marry her. And so this makes him feel really guilty, as if he was willing that, Louise should die so he'd be free to marry, and he's consumed and he's in a dark space. And suddenly this letter comes, and he himself writes that, this case brought him back to normality again. It was a welcome distraction. And so he throws himself into the case. and he says he's going to investigate it. He invites George to meet him. He invites him to a London hotel, and George comes there, and Arthur Conan Doyle is a little late. So when he enters, he stands near the door and he watches. Just like Sherlock Holmes, he's going to make his observations even before he's even spoken to George. So he looks at George. He recognizes him instantly because he's the only Indian in the room. And he's sitting there and he's reading a newspaper, which he holds very close to his face. And he knows instantly that he is myopic. And then he deduces that if this man has such severe myopia, he could not have crossed these dark fields in the middle of a stormy night in August and mutilated cattle. So immediately he's made these deductions, just like Sherlock Holmes does in his books, even before he's met and spoken a word to the person. And he knows that George is innocent and he's going to fight the case. So he sends off for George to have his eyes tested, and he then he's going to do the whole thing. It is actually, interestingly, the only case that Arthur Conan Doyle investigates personally. So he's in full Sherlock Holmes mode. He wears the hat of Sherlock Holmes. In 1907, early morning in January, cold winter day, he catches the train from London to Birmingham, and then changes trains at Birmingham, goes to Great Worley, walks to the vicarage, and meets Charlotte and Shapoorji, has breakfast with them, and hears their story. And he's really moved because, here they tell him about all the old oppression that had happened, the old anonymous letters, the victimizing, and then the miscarriage of justice, the trial, how George is arrested, how nobody helped. And he's of course convinced that a miscarriage has happened and he's going to fight this cause. So he goes, he meets other villagers, he goes to the crime spot, he looks at the field, he crosses the field, and he's now even more convinced that George could not have crossed these fields at night. And then he makes his last stop. He goes to meet the chief of the Staffordshire police. He goes to meet Captain George Anson. Now, Anson is really important in this book as well because Anson is an aristocrat. His family is has had long links with India. One of them was an Admiralty of the Fleet. Another person was given the Victoria Cross in the mutiny, and there are treasures in this huge house from India and China. So he's every bit an imperialist, believes in empire, and he could not stand Shapoorji. And the very fact that what he called him, the Hindu vicar, of course, Shapoorji was not Hindu, he was Parsee, and he was Christian anyway. But he calls him the Hindu vicar, it's just generic. And he says that he doesn't know why a Hindu vicar had been, appointed the vicar of Great Worley to preach to a white parish. So he's already prejudiced. And Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, recognizes this, and he knows that Anson is a racist. So he goes back, and he's as good as his word. Arthur Conan Doyle writes a piece. The case of Mr. George Edalji is published in the Daily Telegraph in January. And here is a photograph of George Edalji. And all this causes a sensation because, suddenly George is famous. This is reproduced all over the country, all over UK and abroad. It's published in the Washington Post in New York. People in the US know about George Edalji. And he's lauded, Arthur Conan lauded by all his fellow writers. So George Bernard Shaw, the various, all his contemporaries, they all come to him and they all say, well done, championing this cause of miscarriage of justice. And Arthur Conan Doyle is really delighted. He says that all of England was singing with the wrongs of George Edalji. So he's very pleased. All this, he clinically and forensically analyzes the events of the trial, and he throws everything out. He says George was myopic. He could not have walked there, which had not been raised at the trial. He throws out all the evidence of the boots and the coat and says how it was all wrong. And he also says, very importantly, again, that this family was the victim of a lot of racism right from the start. So this had not been raised in the trial at all. And he brings up all this. And it puts huge pressure on the Home Office. So, you have writers like Bram Stoker, creator of Dracula, they're all supporting George Edalji, or supporting George and Arthur Conan Doyle's sort of fight for him. And Arthur Conan Doyle compares it to the Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jew was arrested for apparently selling military secrets when it was never him and it was a Frenchman. And there was a cover up when they discovered, the police tried to cover it up. So he says, in France, this happened to a Jew. In England, this is happening to a Parsee. And there is like a lot of noise, a lot of letters to the editors, lots of letters to the Home Office. Finally, Home Office has to give in and they give a free pardon they set up a committee, give a free pardon to George Edalji. And so he's pardoned, but there is a sting in the tail. They do not give him any compensation. They say that he caused the trouble himself and he wrote those letters himself. So you can imagine. Arthur Conan Doyle is furious. He said, if the man is guilty, he should be punished. If the man is not guilty, he should be given compensation. So he demands compensation for George. And he now takes this to the next level. He says, this far, I've tried to prove that George is innocent. Now I'm going to prove who is guilty, who done it. So now begins, this is George himself writing, I am innocent. You can see he writes his own story. Now Arthur Conan Doyle starts this investigation and he starts corresponding with Anson. So this is what he thinks is he draws the instrument he thinks has caused this harm. He then starts barraging with the letters, Anson with letters. Anson is furious because he doesn't want to be taught policing by a man who writes crime fiction. He says, I'm the real policeman here. So there's a huge ego clash that takes place. But Arthur Conan Doyle then starts publishing these letters in further articles titled Who Wrote the Letters? He prints these letters, anonymous letters, and he says, compare the handwritings. So this is one of the anonymous false letters, and this is George's actual handwriting. And he asks the readers to compare this. So all this goes on, and there is a clash. So the third part of the book is this huge clash between these two eminent Victorians, George Anson and Arthur Conan Doyle, and they are going hammer and tongs at each other, and it's all great fun. But of course, at this stage, you're asking, you're wondering, does Arthur Conan Doyle solve this mystery? And of course, I'm not going to tell you because you have to read the book. It's a thriller, and you have to follow all the twists and turns and see what happens in the end and whether this Whirly Ripper is finally caught. So meanwhile, what happens to George? He gets older. He is allowed to work, of course. He's readmitted to the solicitor's roles. He practices as a solicitor. So he practices in London. He never returns to Great Whirly. And well, eventually he dies at the age of 73. And his life he's just forgotten. This is his grave. Though his story was so famous, this is his grave. I mean, you can see this bit was covered with weeds like that, and I had to pull them out. It took me 4 hours in this place to find his grave. And finally, when I pulled out all these weeds, it revealed his name, vaguely Thompson, and then the full name, George Edward Thompson Edalji. So this was the story, which, he is forgotten, unlike the Dreyfus affair, which is, known so well, which has been made into films and books written about them and everything else. But poor George was forgotten. But this is his story. This is his life. A very unremarkable chap who just became famous because of Arthur Conan Doyle and a case and a miscarriage of justice. But the one legacy that he left behind was that the law changed. And this was the start of the Criminal Court of Appeal. First time, 1907, Britain allowed a Criminal Court of Appeal. So convicted prisoners could go to the next court, which wasn't there for George, which is why he had to petition the Home Office. So this was his little contribution. And here he is buried outside London in a place called Welwyn Garden City with his sister Maud. They are both in the same grave. So I'll end it there. Thank you for listening. And I am going to take questions if we have time. About 50 minutes, I think, for questions.
Hi, thank you so much, Shravani. That was wonderful. Thank you. If you have questions, please.
May I?
Sorry, Myrna who talks. She put a question in the chat box, so we'll just take that first.
Yeah.
Hutakshi is asking, why did the vicars from other towns around England not help George or Shapoorji?
It's really, yeah, it's true. This poor family got no help from anybody. And it is amazing that it's only after after the trial that people started rallying around, and these 10,000 signatures came from doctors, lawyers, and others. But while all this was happening, and the vicar was being victimized like this, and all this race hate was happening, nobody really came to his support. Not the police, not the locals. It's quite tragic, really. Yeah.
Why do you think that would have happened?
I don't know. I can't answer for them, but I guess they were just not bothered. Everyone.
Just racial prejudice.
Yeah, and maybe Shapoorji didn't go to them for help. Maybe if he was quite a proud man. He did what he had to do. He went to the press and he went to the police, and he thought they might solve it, but they weren't bothered, So this is what happened. Maybe if he had gone. In fact, I was thinking that at this time, there was actually a Parsee MP, because one of the MPs, his name was Manchaji Bhavnagri. He was an MP at this time. Shapoorji could have gone to him, but he didn't. So who knows? He probably just thought what he needed to do was go to the police. And then, he had this attitude of, which many immigrants have, just get on with life. It's these corner shops which were attacked, with graffiti and things thrown in. They would wipe it off, open the shop again the next day, mend the windows and start again. So maybe in some ways he was a typical immigrant who just got on with his life. And so did George.
Thank you.
I guess that he had lost his Parsee connections. He was no longer a Parsee, He was a Christian, he was a vicar. And he just tried to go on from there.
That's true, but he didn't appeal to his other Christian vicars,
either. No,
so
he didn't do that either. Because again, maybe he faced some kind of racial prejudice.
Exactly. So, unfortunately, just sort of.
So the family just kept to themselves.
Yeah. Right.
Tried to do the right thing, but that was it, really.
Yeah.
Well, and Rita, it's unfortunate that, as you said all over the place, that he was imprisoned mostly because of his looks.
Yeah. Yeah. He was,
they
commented on his appearance all the time.
Ugly looking, his jaw, his bulging eyes, whatever. But it's sad that because of that, he was, just.
Yeah, he was. It sort of, it labeled him, his appearance.
It just boils down to prejudice, I guess.
Totally.
That's why I want to ask you, when did you first come across this case? It was obviously before the lockdown, before the pandemic, before Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, long back. I knew about it, over 20 years ago. But, I have a busy job. I'm a journalist here, and I was also working on other books. So, it's one of those things you think about that you'd like to go and visit sometime, but it was just parked there. So I finished all my other books. And because I like to write about these forgotten stories, all my books are about people, Noor Inayat Khan was, forgotten, all the story of Victoria and Abdul, when nobody had heard of Abdul Karim, and this whole Queen Victoria connection. So it's what I do. I'm always looking for unusual people. But it's only when in 2015, there was an auction. So there was a little news item about an auction of letters. And these letters were between Arthur Conan Doyle and Anson. And they dealt with this case. So I said, oh gosh, this is new material, definitely something in there. And that's when I said, I have to go back to this case. And I followed up on the letters, and that started it. And that started the journey. it took 4 years, 5 years to write this book,
A
actually.
lot of research.
A lot of research, because obviously I went to Birmingham, and there are records in Staffordshire in the, the police courts, and there's records in the National Archives, the Home Office files, the police files. There's letters between Arthur Conan Doyle and Anson, and also I had to read all the newspaper reports of the time, which was very interesting. So, just to see their attitude, because that's where you can really feel the pulse of the people.
Yeah.
So, combining all that took a long time. The final edits were done during the lockdown.
A super read, really a super read.
Thank you.
One thing I felt a little let down about was the brother Horace.
Mm-hmm.
After you did explain that he didn't get on with the family. Naturally, they were concentrating all their efforts on George, and he was obviously jealous of that. And he wasn't as bright as George. But at a certain point, quite early in the novel, he is just not mentioned again, except that he left. And then from time to time, you see maybe Charlotte's letter, which to the Home Office, which says, my husband, daughter, and I. There's no mention of the other son. And that left me a little hanging. What happened to Horace? Why is he? And then he confided in some friend that George wrote those letters. So I somehow got the feeling that he was more involved in the whole thing. And obviously he wasn't really.
Horace was very different. He really wanted to, remember, he was really young when all this started. So he faced the full horror of his elder brother being, his father being victimized, his elder brother being victimized. And he was actually, whereas George, as you saw from the images, he's dark skinned. He looks very, very Indian. Horace, it is a mixed marriage. Horace looks more, he can pass off. He had fairer skin. He was never targeted in the letters as a child. And to me, that's very clear that it's because he was more fair skinned. He was, obviously he had more friends in school because he's fairer. He could blend in, and George couldn't. He was alienated from the family right from the start. He was obviously bit jealous of George, who got all the attention. And then, I won't give all the details because you've got to read the book, but, he sort of does some things in the book that, are against George. And then the family sort of wipe him off. He's not left anything. He cuts himself off from the family. And at the end, he marries an Irish woman and actually changes his surname. He takes her name. So it's the sort of umbilical cord is completely cut. And so what Shapurji did when he left Bombay, left his faith and, took Christianity, came to this country and never looked back, I think was carried forward by, in some ways, by Horace, who then said, whatever's left of this Parsee connection, I've had enough of it. I've had enough of, everything that's happened. And he just cut himself off. Who knows what was going on in his mind. And then he took his wife's surname. He's buried in Dublin under his wife's surname. So Horace McGee. So it's a dysfunctional family, as many families are. But there was a lot going on. But there's a lot of intrigue which you'll find in the book.
Shrabani, Rita has a question. Rita, would you like to ask?
Yeah.
It was similar to what Myrna asked. It's surprising that the racism by the Christian, the racism in the Christian church, he shouldn't have had to even ask the Christian church to rally around him. They should have been forthcoming. Like, I'm sure if it was a white vicar, he would have been supported, and the entire church would have come to his aid. So terribly racist for him to have changed his faith, become a vicar, and then to have experienced that. It was very sad, but I'm looking forward to reading all your books. I've seen the movie Victoria and Abdul. I've seen it again a couple of times, and now I need to read all your books.
Okay, excellent.
I want to read Noor Inayat Khan. I haven't read that.
Thanks, Rita. Parul has a question. Did you face any difficulties or resistance while you were researching the story?
No, I didn't. I mean, there was a lot of research, so it took a lot of time, various archives, various materials sort of scattered in various places. So it was the time factor. The only problems I faced were because I work as a journalist, it was a time of a lot of political events that were going on. So I had to keep abandoning the book because we had Brexit here, we had this, we had that, we had three prime ministers that changed. So I was constantly working as well as reporting. And the last bit, of course, was the pandemic. I mean, that just then took out took all of us out. But what happened is I was just feeling how relevant all this is because, as Black Lives Matter exploded, and you just feel that this happened over 100 years ago, but what has changed in the society? It just became so clear that this whole story is still relevant today. There is still miscarriage of justice. There are still, during the pandemic, who was rounded up, because everyone's in lockdown. I mean, the people who were stopped and searched if they were driving, most of them, they said 60% were Black people. So Blacks were rounded up. Who were the people in the jails? Who is fined? It's always, people of color, as they say. So, what has changed? And this prejudice that continues, report after report shows that there is sort of, some say, institutional racism in the police force, still injustice. And if it isn't overt racism, what has happened is prejudice, an unconscious bias that if a Black guy is driving a Mercedes and going somewhere, there was a Black MP and she was driving a Mercedes and she was pulled up in East London. And she's a Labour MP. And they said, where are you going? Your car has a different number plate. It's from Yorkshire. Just complete nonsense. She said, I'm an MP. And the only reason, she later went on social media and spoke in Parliament and said, the only reason I was pulled out is because I'm a Black MP. I'm a Black woman driving a Mercedes. Immediately they think stolen car.
It's a red flag for them. Yeah.
And she was anyway. So, it just shows prejudice everywhere still exists. And it's not just UK, I mean, it's US and it's India and it's everywhere. Yeah. So that is something we live with in society still.
But the UK and India, we have a very special relationship. We've had, for all these years of being together in different ways. So will you tell us about how things have changed between, you've seen, and you've written about many times you've written about it in Victoria and Abdul, of course, especially towards the end when she dies. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, if you have time, is to tell us about the statues. There was a time when they wanted to pull down the statue of this guy.
They did pull down Edward Colston in Bristol.
Yeah. And then I remember you wrote or you spoke, and that was such an amazing thing about the statues. Mm-hmm. So these two things, please.
Yeah, so as I said, last year, Black Lives Matter just exploded. And I think it exploded in the West because everyone was then reckoning with their histories and what had happened. And suddenly you had, footballers, famous names, footballers, people in the music industry coming out and speaking for the first time, cricketers saying how much racism they had faced. And these are celebrities, so it took a lot for them to come out and say, yes, we went through this. As well. So it really hit you as to how much discrimination people had faced all along and all, silently just got on with it. So it did explode. And of course, in Bristol, the statue came down. He was a slave trader called Edward Colston, and they pulled down the statue. And now the statue was then taken out. It's been displayed in a museum in Bristol. But because he was damaged, they're not spending money, fixing the statue. They're displaying it with all the red paint and the graffiti lying down. So it tells the story of Colston. It tells the story of protest. And so this piece itself has become so important. So that is the story of, statues. And of course, now it's become a huge thing that, laws being made, the statue should not be pulled down, they should be done, if anything has to be removed, it has to be done with consultation, etc., etc. But, the interesting thing is that everybody thinks it's young Black people who went and pulled the statue down, and it isn't. If you see the footage, there are a lot of young white people. So, just like George Edalji had the support of 10,000 people, and they were not, they were not Indians in UK at the time. They were all white people. I'd say there might have been 10 Indian signatures but most of them would have been white. So similarly, I think there is a lot of awareness, and there's a lot of white people who support these causes and who don't want to see this discrimination. But unfortunately, those who want, who say no, empire, this, and we are the best, they're the loudest voices, so they get heard. And then you get the rabble to support you, and that, I think, that happens everywhere. It happened in the US, it happens here. And those who shout the loudest manage to be heard. But I think the vast majority, all the Black Lives Matter protests here, was a mix of young people, black and white, a lot of, and Asians. So it's not something that is just a small minority of blacks who are fighting for their rights. I think everyone feels that this really has to move on, and you have to deal with your past. So museums are rethinking. I mean, they haven't done enough, but at least the conversation has started. They're classifying things. They feel they need to explain the story behind some people and objects. So that's all become a big thing.
Shrabani, there's a question from Amrita. Given that there was this much racism, how did Edalji get appointed as a vicar?
Well, I think Shapuji basically, as I said in the thing, that, a little bit of favoritism happened because it was Charlotte's family, her uncle, who actually gave him the gift. And maybe that itself caused resentment, because he was clearly somebody who had a bit of privilege, who got that post. So that might have caused some, and then he must have clashed with, the landlords in the area, which there's a little of local politics that happens. We don't know, where he managed to, get these people sort of resentful against him, about him. And it's, well, he was the first, and he lasted. The main thing is that he did really good work in his area. Despite all of this, he was a good vicar. He stayed there for 40 years, and he's buried. His grave is in the vicarage. So, and it says there, the plaque says there, vicar of Great Burley for 40 years. That's quite a record. So yeah, he carried on with his work, and did well. He did his job of a vicar as he should have.
The most interesting thing is that, he was a vicar, and they're still calling him, or maybe just his family members, a Parsee. How does that get explained? Is it because, I don't know. I mean,
it's just ignorance, but also, of course, I mean, Parsi is a ethnic thing. So Zoroastrianism is a religion. Parsi, you remain a Parsi, your religion, even if you change your religion, right? Because that's your ethnic identity. But of course, all these people didn't know anything. I mean, they used to call him the Hindu vicar, so they had no idea. To them, he was an Indian, and to most Indians were always referred to as Hindus, with a double O. So that's how it was. Even, in my earlier book, Victoria and Abdul, when Abdul comes to the court, they all say, oh, the Hindus have arrived. And of course, Abdul Karim and Muhammad Baksh were not Hindus, they were Muslims. Hindus wouldn't even, they didn't want to cross the seas. That's why there were more Muslims at that time as travelers. They didn't want to cross the Kalapani, the dark waters. But they would all be referred to as the Hindus. And for a long time, everyone thought they were Hindus. I mean, they didn't even know. They don't know the difference. So it's ignorance. It's complete ignorance.
There's a question from Rajesh. The other people who have written about this case are all white. Did they all have the same point of view as yours?
Well, the only person who has written about it is Julian Barnes. So he wrote Arthur and George, and that's fiction. So it's a novel. He's a brilliant writer, and he's made a novel out of it. But mine is nonfiction, so it's got all the facts. And I look into the background, and I look into what happened afterwards. So they're very different books in that sense, though the characters are the same. But one is fiction, and I look into what happened, and I look into how Arthur Conan Doyle investigates. So it's also a lot of my following the trail of Arthur Conan Doyle as he investigates. And it revealed, because Julian Barnes obviously didn't consult police. I mean, these are all in the new letters that were released, so he would not have known about them. So what I found in the police files was absolutely shocking, that Anson was actually laying false trails for Arthur Conan Doyle. And so all this new material is there in my book, which, well, is different and shows what was actually going on behind the scenes. Any other?
What's your new book going to be about?
No, nothing yet. I've just finished this one, just released it. So this has just released. So I'll take a
Okay.
while.
It's
My books take a
fascinating.
while.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Right, I can see messages coming up.
Lots of thank you messages and enjoy the
Right.
talk messages. I will send you the chat file.
That's okay. Thanks.
One last question. I don't know whether it got answered. Did you face any difficulties
Right.
in accessing the material?
No, these are all open files. So luckily here,
All right.
these are-
Thankfully.
they're in libraries and in archives. So apart from having to search for them, which takes a long time, no, they are open. Once you get them, they are open files.
Even the police files?
Yeah. Everything's
All
there.
right.
It's
All
with
right.
all the notes and in various different libraries. So they're all sourced in the book. You can see where they are from.
Great. This is really wonderful, lovely hearing the story from you.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much. Thank you again, Shrabani. You really,
welcome.
it's been so generous of you to give us your time and all the effort you made to
First
tell us
of all,
about your
right,
book. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And well, enjoy the book and read
Thanks.
I
in the
did
back.
thoroughly. Couldn't
Yeah.
put it down.
Oh, thank you.
Right.
Most of us here have actually read, if not all your books, some of them. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Bye-bye.
there's
Stay safe,
one more.
everybody.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
इतने अच्छे से author, it was a story, but I've left.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Bye.